stay on, blast and cruise, because that is the best thing you could possibly do if you're going to be running PEDs. You also want to extend your cycle to something like 16 to 24 weeks. So you blast for 16 to 24 weeks, and then you cruise at a TRT dosage of 150 to 200 milligrams. And when you do a cruise, you can supplement it with something like HCG for the...
So what he's describing isn't really blasting and cruising, it's just cycling on and off steroids intermixed with going back to TRT. So he's using high doses of synthetic androgens, then he's back on TRT. High doses of synthetic androgens, back on TRT. That's actually a very smart thing to do, because the number one class of diseases that kills PED users long term are heart and vascular causes, okay? Heart attacks, strokes, burst aneurysms, things like that. And believe it or not, the biggest risk factor, it appears, to develop one of those issues, it's long duration of exposure to supratherapeutic doses of androgens. Okay, so it's a duration of exposure effect. It's a cumulative time on supratherapeutic doses of androgens effect. So what he's describing, by pulling back to 150 milligrams of testosterone, that's just TRT doses of testosterone, you're actually lowering your cumulative lifetime exposure to supratherapeutic doses of androgens. And ideally, you would do this with a physician. I'm not telling anybody to get TRT, just do it by yourself. That's not what I'm saying at all. But that is the best way to do it, is to cycle. And what he's describing is cycling, and TRT does not count as cruising, because in point of fact, when you come off the high doses of synthetic androgens, you're going to be hypogonadal. Okay? So just using TRT, all you're doing, that's just treating a medical condition. Okay, so that is actually the best way to do things from a risk reduction perspective. And when you come back on TRT, it's a bonus if you can get off the aromatase inhibitor completely, because then you let your estradiol levels recover. Okay, part of the damage that you get from synthetic androgens long term is when you use a lot of non-aromatizable androgens, and especially if you're using AIs, you're really suppressing your androgen to estradiol ratios, and that's important on endothelium and heart muscle cells, which that causes a massive redox imbalance. That's what causes accumulated damage over time. So if you get on TRT without the AI for those periods that you're off cycle, that's even better for your long-term health. So another way to explain the whole redefinition of cruise, blast, etc., is to look at a graph where you can see visually where the risks of long-term synthetic androgen use come from. It is not, strictly speaking, related to the doses that you use for short periods of time. Obviously, using very high doses of certain compounds can be very catastrophic and even deadly. But the point is that what people need to look out for when they use synthetic androgens long term is their duration of exposure above this line, 200 to 300 milligrams a week of aromatizable androgens. Why is that line important? And that line is obviously not set in stone. As there's more research done, it may go down, it may go up, but that is what is considered so-called TRT doses, 200 to 300 milligrams a week of testosterone, okay? Above that line, things that are known to happen, especially when you're talking about synthetic androgens other than testosterone, but even testosterone at these doses, you get dyslipidemia, you get accelerated plaque deposition, you get mitochondrial damage, you get endothelial dysfunction. Okay? So if you're really cruising, you're really just using lower but still supratherapeutic doses. Okay, and that's why these compounds are listed here as an example. Another consideration is that if you're using aromatase inhibitors, you are doing compounded damage. Okay, now maybe you have to be on an aromatase inhibitor. This is not a video to argue that all professional bodybuilders and people on SAs can never use aromatase inhibitors. That's not what this is about. But it's simply a fact that when you are using a lot of non-aromatizable androgens coupled with aromatase inhibitors, you do compound damage. And how do you do compound damage? Through this mechanism right here. This is what happens on endothelial cells, meaning cells that line heart and blood vessels, and on cardiomyocytes. Okay? So as you can see, this is testosterone, but may as well be any kind of non-aromatizable androgen. They exert these downstream cellular effects. Okay? Some of them they exert by altering gene transcription. Some of them they alter through non-genomic ways. Okay, the important thing is that androgens unopposed cause increase in reactive oxygen species, which you see right here on the right in brown. They cause oxidative stress, lipid accumulation, cell death. So they increase the oxidant state of the cell, of heart muscle cells and endothelial cells. The way that that is balanced out naturally is through the aromatization process. Is that testosterone gets aromatized to estradiol, and it's the estradiol that enters into the cell and exerts the exact opposite effects. Okay, it reduces oxidative stress, it reduces mitochondrial damage. So anytime you're using an aromatase inhibitor and or non-aromatizable androgens, meaning androgens that act through this mechanism, but some do not get converted locally to estradiol, all you're doing is compounding this effect right here. You're compounding the oxidative effect. And over long periods of time, it's the oxidative stress that leads to cell death. And past a certain point in time, that's when you start to get serious things like heart failure, myocardial infarctions, vascular issues, things like that. So the purpose of this graph is not to argue definitions with people. It's just to get them to think of anabolic steroids in a different kind of way. It's to get them to think that instead of doing this kind of pattern where it doesn't matter, your doses are a little bit lower here in this so-called cruise phase, but they're still above the threshold at which all these negative problems happen. And it's the cumulative damage that's important. So what I'm advocating as a risk reduction strategy is this. And I understand that a lot of people call TRT cruising. I get that. But we need to redefine what cruising means. Because in point of fact, when you come off these high doses of synthetic androgens and all you're on is a therapy dose of testosterone, whether you're with HCG or not, you're treating post-anabolic steroid use hypogonadism, okay? Because your testosterone levels plummet after this. Your gonadotropin levels are basically zero after this. So all you're doing is treating a deficiency state. And then eventually, you're on the compounds again. But at least doing it this way, as you can see, the total time of exposure is lower in this way than it is in this way, where everything that you're doing is adding to all these problems on the right side. So that was really my whole point, and I don't know if this really helped to explain it better, but hopefully it did.